Jason Miller rolled down the dusty mountain road in his beat-up 1998 Toyota Tacoma, a cooler full of supplies rattling in the truck bed. The trees whispered their secrets as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting gold and crimson light across the Colorado wilderness. After 30 years in the tech industry, 2 divorces, and 1 near heart attack, Jason wasn't running anymore. He was reclaiming something that had been his all along. The cabin came into view through the trees, a modest hand-built log structure perched beside a still lake. His grandfather had built it in 1963, a quiet retreat from the chaos of the world. When it passed to Jason, he made minimal changes: solar panels on the roof, a well for water, and a reinforced fireplace for the brutal winters. This was solitude. This was his sanity. Jason parked and sat on the tailgate, breathing the thin mountain air. No car alarms, no traffic, no artificial light, just the chirping of birds and the occasional rustle of a deer in the underbrush. For the past 5 years, this had been his weekend haven, the place where emails couldn't find him and HOA board members didn't exist. Or so he thought. That changed on a Tuesday afternoon. He'd driven up to spend a week fixing the roof and cleaning out the chimney. Halfway up the gravel path that curved through the woods, he noticed something strange. A gate, bright white, aluminum, and absurdly modern, now stood at the entrance to the trail he always used. Attached to it was a sign: "Private property, no trespassing, HOA access only, violators will be prosecuted." Jason stared at it in disbelief. He shifted into park, got out, and walked up to the gate. His road, his family's access trail, the road carved out before the HOA even existed. He pulled out his phone, took a picture of the sign, then dialed the number on the placard. The phone rang 4 times before a clipped female voice answered. "Cedar Ridge HOA, this is Karen." Jason exhaled slowly. "Hi, Karen. I'm Jason Miller. I own the property at 92 Aspen Hollow, the cabin by Carter Lake. I use this road, well, used to use it, to access my property. There's a new gate here." "Ah," she replied, and he could hear the smile forming in her voice. "Yes, we recently installed security measures. The road you're referring to is now part of Cedar Ridge's protected zone. As a non-member, you're not permitted vehicle access." Jason's jaw tightened. "I've been using this road for years. It predates your development by decades. You can't just—" "We've done our research," she interrupted. "The easement wasn't recorded with the county, so legally, the land belongs to the HOA. You'll need to find another route." He paused, stunned. Another route? Through what? Solid forest, vertical rock face. That road is the only way in unless I airlift supplies by drone. Karen didn't flinch. "I'm sorry, Mr. Miller. If you have concerns, please consult legal counsel. Good day." The line went dead. Jason stood there, wind ruffling his jacket, heart pounding. The audacity of it was infuriating. His grandfather had built that road with his own hands, laid gravel over months, all with written permission from the old rancher who had owned the land before the HOA ever existed. But that was decades ago, and written permission wasn't always the same as a recorded easement. He climbed over the gate and walked the remaining half-mile to the cabin. The tranquility of the setting sun was lost on him now, replaced with thoughts of county records, land law, and property rights. He couldn't even drive in his tools or food. If he wanted firewood, he'd have to carry it on his back. That night, in front of the fire, Jason pulled out a dusty binder from the cabin's shelf, a collection of documents his grandfather had kept. Letters, permits, survey maps. And there it was, a yellowing letter from 1972, handwritten and signed by Frank Delaney, the original rancher. It granted Jason's grandfather, Arthur Miller, and his descendants unrestricted access through the Delaney Trail for purposes of ingress and egress to the lakeside property. It wasn't filed officially. That much he now realized. Back then, folks sealed deals with a handshake and a promise, but those promises meant little to a modern HOA full of retired lawyers and realtors. Jason knew one thing. They may have shut his road, but they weren't ready for what came next. He wasn't a hothead. He didn't scream or post online rants. He strategized, and when he looked at the maps, at the layout of the entire Cedar Ridge development, he saw something they had missed. Their only access road, the one they paved and landscaped and guarded with cameras, crossed the edge of his property by about 60 feet. A smirk crept across Jason's face as he sipped black coffee from an old enamel mug. He opened his laptop, connected to his offline GIS maps, and began planning. He had been polite, reasonable, civil. But now it was time to play by their rules. And Jason played to win. 3 days after climbing over the newly installed gate to reach his cabin, Jason Miller sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad, jotting down every detail he could remember about the Cedar Ridge HOA and their sudden takeover of the access road. Old land maps were spread out in front of him, and the 1972 letter from Frank Delaney, granting access to his grandfather, was carefully sleeved in a plastic protector. He was formulating a plan, a calm, precise one, when he heard a knock on his cabin door. Jason tensed. No one ever knocked on his door. Ever. He stood slowly, slid the curtain aside, and saw a clean-cut man in a navy blazer standing with a yellow envelope in hand. His SUV was parked just past the trees, tires still crackling from the gravel. "Mr. Jason Miller?" the man asked, offering the envelope like it was a birthday card. "Yes. You've been formally served. Good day." Jason watched him turn, stride back to his car, and drive off down the trail, the same one he was now forbidden to use. Back inside, he tore open the envelope. The heading read, "Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association, Notice of Trespassing and Cease and Desist Order." It was almost laughable. The document accused Jason of illegally accessing private property belonging to the Cedar Ridge HOA, of removing or tampering with physical security barriers, and warned of legal consequences should he continue unauthorized presence or attempt vehicular access. Jason leaned back in his chair, letting out a long, exasperated breath. It was all legal fluff. No mention of his grandfather's letter. No recognition of historical access. Just cold, bureaucratic muscle flexing. He poured himself a drink, just one, and stared at the paper. He had options. He could fight it in court. It would be expensive, drawn out, and uncertain. That easement wasn't recorded, and the county wasn't going to take a 50-year-old handshake letter as binding law. Not on its own. But he also had leverage. With renewed focus, Jason pulled up satellite images on his laptop. He zoomed in on the Cedar Ridge development. 78 homes, 2 cul-de-sacs, a community center, and a single paved road connecting the entire neighborhood to the county highway. That road crossed a thin sliver of land. His land. He remembered his grandfather pointing it out once when Jason was a kid. That little triangle. It's useless. But it's ours, keeps folks honest. Jason had laughed back then. Now that useless triangle had become a kingmaker's piece. The next day, Jason drove back down the mountain the long way, a brutal, winding trail through forest and shallow creek beds that took 3 times longer than the old road. But it was legal. No one could stop him from using the land he did have access to. He reached the county recorder's office just after lunch. Inside, the walls were lined with dusty books and folders dating back over 100 years. Jason met with a clerk named Cynthia, who was all too familiar with fights between landowners and developers. "I'm looking for 2 things," Jason told her. any recorded easements related to my property, and a deed history on parcel number 716-0-3-421. She squinted at the number, then smiled. Oh, that triangle. I know it. Not many people own land that narrow unless they're fencing off utility poles. Jason explained what was happening: the gate, the road, the HOA, and their letter. Cynthia nodded. Well, you're not going to like this, but I can tell you now. There's no recorded easement in your name or your grandfather's. Nothing official. But, she added, it looks like your property line overlaps with the eastern shoulder of Cedar Ridge Road. It's narrow, but yeah, their access road crosses it. Is it public or private? Jason asked. She tapped on her screen. Private, maintained by the HOA. That road exists because of a development variance filed back in 2005. But if it crosses your land and there's no recorded easement from you to them, they could be the ones trespassing. Jason smiled. That's what I needed to hear. That night, back at his cabin, Jason drafted his own letter. To Cedar Ridge HOA, Board of Directors. Unauthorized use of private land. Dear board members, it has come to my attention that Cedar Ridge Road, the sole access point for your entire community, crosses a portion of land owned by me, legally described as parcel number 716-03-421. This road was constructed without my permission, and I have not granted any easement for its use. Effective immediately, I am revoking any implied or previously assumed permission for the use of my land as part of your roadway infrastructure. You are hereby given 30 days to cease all use of this road segment and to reroute traffic through legal and appropriate means. Failure to comply will result in the installation of barriers and the pursuit of damages for unauthorized use and trespass. Sincerely, Jason Miller, property owner, Aspen Hollow. He sent it certified mail, return receipt requested. He knew what would happen next: panic. Meetings, angry emails, HOA board members scrambling to figure out how a man they tried to bully had just turned the tables. But Jason wasn't bluffing. The law worked both ways. And if the HOA thought they could play legal hardball, they had no idea who they were up against. The Cedar Ridge HOA board met on the first Tuesday of every month in the community center, a well-manicured building with faux stone siding and too many flags. Normally, the agenda was full of mundane issues: dog waste complaints, paint color approvals, and the occasional feud over backyard fences. But this time, the boardroom buzzed with urgency. Karen Fielding, HOA president and part-time real estate agent, stood at the head of the long mahogany table. Her usual confident air was thinner than usual. Beside her, HOA attorney Mark Dales flipped through a printed copy of Jason Miller's letter, his lips tight with concern. We have a problem, Mark said, breaking the murmuring crowd of homeowners who'd turned out in surprising numbers. This letter, if legitimate, puts the board, and by extension the entire community, in a serious liability situation. Karen stiffened. It's a bluff. That road has been there since the development was approved in 2005. If it crossed private land, the county would have caught it. Mark shook his head. Not necessarily. Development variances don't always involve in-depth property line analysis, especially if no one raised objections. According to county records, Mr. Miller's land does indeed overlap a portion of Cedar Ridge Road. The triangle is narrow, but the right-of-way crosses about 60 feet through his property line at a crucial curve. A murmur of worry passed through the room. Homeowners exchanged glances. For most of them, Cedar Ridge Road was the only way in or out. It curved around a ridge, hugged a steep bluff, and wound up toward the gates. There was no alternate access, No back road, no service lane. Just that one vulnerable path. "If he puts up a fence or gate, what happens?" asked Dan Whitmore, a longtime resident and retired military pilot. "You'd all be landlocked," Mark replied bluntly. "Emergency services would be affected. Deliveries, utilities, school buses, everything." Someone cursed under their breath. Karen folded her arms. "We can't let him do this. There has to be something we can threaten him with." Mark raised an eyebrow. "We already tried that. You had him served with a cease and desist based on a presumed easement, which doesn't exist. Now he's responding with a legally valid property claim. If we escalate, we risk a countersuit. Frankly, we're in the wrong here." The board fell silent. Finally, Sylvia Meeks, an older woman with sharp glasses and a sharper tongue, spoke up. "What are our options?" Mark exhaled. "Well, there are three. Negotiate an easement, offer him compensation for legal access rights, and hope he accepts. Attempt eminent domain, through the county. Risky, costly, and could take years. Ignore the letter, and wait for him to act, which could backfire spectacularly if he blocks the road." Karen scoffed. "You're saying we pay him?" "I'm saying if you want your residents to sleep at night, you might consider humility," Mark replied. Meanwhile, just over a mile away, Jason sat on his porch, sipping coffee, watching the evening light shimmer across Carter Lake. He wasn't celebrating. Not yet, but he allowed himself a quiet grin. He had received the return receipt that morning. The letter had been signed for, which meant they'd read it, which meant the gears were turning. He had spent the last few days making preparations, measuring the 60-foot section of road, checking GPS coordinates, staking out the exact points where his property line met the asphalt. He wasn't guessing anymore. This was precise, calculated. He didn't want revenge. He wanted respect. The HOA had slammed a gate across his only access route with zero warning, then threatened him with legal action like he was some squatter in the woods. They thought he'd roll over. Instead, they triggered the worst-case scenario, an engineer with time, principle, and legal ownership of their Achilles heel. That evening, a white Lexus drove slowly up the long path to his cabin. The other path, the rough one they never used. It stopped near the woodpile, and Karen Fielding stepped out in impractical shoes and a fitted red blazer. Jason didn't move. He just watched her approach. "Mr. Miller," she said, forcing a smile, "I was hoping we could talk." "You've got 30 feet before you hit my property," he replied calmly. "Be careful where you step." Karen flushed. "Look, we got your letter. I think things may have escalated too quickly on both sides." "No," Jason said. "They didn't escalate. You started with threats. I'm simply responding." She pursed her lips. "Is there any way we can resolve this amicably?" Jason motioned to the chair across from him. "Sit." She hesitated, then did. "I'm not asking for a fight," Jason continued, "but I won't let you push me off a road that's been used for 50 years. My grandfather drove cattle down that trail before your development existed. The fact that it wasn't recorded doesn't make it right for you to put up a gate and pretend I don't exist." Karen opened her mouth, but Jason raised a hand. "I know the law now. I know that road of yours crosses my land, and I'm giving you a choice." She blinked. "Which is?" "You take down your gate. You restore access. Or in 10 days, I legally block Cedar Ridge Road. Permanently. Not with a chain. With concrete, boulders, and reinforced fencing. You'll need a helicopter to get your groceries." Karen sat in stunned silence. "I'm not bluffing," Jason said, "and I'm not interested in money. I want the gate down and an apology. You fix it. This ends." Karen swallowed hard. "I'll bring it to the board." Jason stood. "You do that?" As she walked away, Jason looked out over the lake, wondering just how far they'd push him and how far he was willing to go. Because this wasn't about roads anymore. It was about principle. And principles don't bend. They either stand or they break everything around them. The next morning, Jason was up before the sun, boots on and shovel in hand, marking off the final boundary line with bright orange surveyor's flags. He'd driven iron stakes into the soil the night before and double-checked every GPS reading. The 60-foot stretch of road cutting across his property was no longer just a strip of dirt and gravel. It was a symbol. This wasn't just a legal standoff anymore. It had become a matter of survival. Either they respected his right to access, or they learned what it meant to lose theirs. He knew the HOA wasn't going to fold easily. People like that rarely did. They'd try to delay, offer half promises, maybe even challenge his claim in court. So Jason did what any reasonable man would do when backed into a corner by bureaucratic bullies. He started building a wall. Not metaphorically, literally. He hauled in fence posts, heavy-duty mesh, cement bags, and bolts of barbed wire. 2 local contractors he trusted, old friends from his construction days, volunteered to help. He didn't tell them the full story, just that he needed a barrier fast, legal, and immovable. "You sure you want to go through with this?" one of them asked as they pounded the first post into the ground. Jason nodded. "They didn't leave me a choice." Word spread quickly. Residents of Cedar Ridge woke up one morning to find the beginnings of a fence on the outer curve of their only access road. At first, most didn't understand what they were seeing. They assumed it was for wildlife control or maintenance. But as the posts continued to go up, the panic set in. Karen Fielding called an emergency HOA meeting that evening. The community center filled faster than it ever had. Neighbors talked over one another. Someone passed around a printout of Jason's warning letter. Another neighbor had taken drone photos of the fence under construction and brought them to share. "This is blackmail," one man shouted. "He's holding us hostage." "He's protecting his land," another countered. "Maybe we pushed him too far." Karen stood and pounded the gavel to quiet the room. "Everyone, please. We're working with legal counsel to resolve this. Mr. Miller's actions are premature and possibly illegal. We're asking the sheriff's office to intervene." "The sheriff can't do anything," Mark, the HOA lawyer, interrupted. "He's well within his rights. The land is his. The road crosses it. If we want him to stop, we need to negotiate or sue. And I remind you, lawsuits cost money." An older man in the back stood. "We can't afford to wait months. What happens if he finishes the fence?" Mark looked grim. "Then you're all stuck." Back at the cabin, Jason kept building. He didn't enjoy it. Every board he bolted in place, every foot of wire he unrolled, felt like a small death to the peaceful life he'd tried so hard to create. He wanted no war, no headlines, just his trail back, and the dignity of being treated like a fellow landowner, not a trespasser. He paused midday to drink water, wiping sweat from his forehead, when a black SUV pulled up on the gravel near the boundary line. Out stepped Karen, again, this time not alone. With her was a man in his 60s, silver-haired, dressed like a corporate mediator, clipboard in hand. "I brought a proposal," Karen said cautiously. Jason set the water jug down and waited. The man introduced himself as Richard Bowen, a land use consultant and former county commissioner. "We believe we can settle this without further escalation. The board is prepared to formally recognize your access rights to the original trail, in perpetuity, in exchange for an easement allowing the continued use of Cedar Ridge Road." Jason raised an eyebrow. "You mean the same trail you illegally blocked a week ago?" Karen bristled. "We didn't have all the information at the time." Jason stared at them both, unimpressed. And now that you do, you're here hoping I'll forget the gate, the cease and desist, and the trespassing letter, all to save you from losing your only road out. Bowen cleared his throat. Let's not make this personal. This is just business, Mr. Miller. Jason shook his head. It stopped being just business when you tried to lock me out of my own home. Karen stepped forward. What do you want, Jason? Just name it. We can negotiate a number. I don't want money, he said. I want my grandfather's trail recognized as mine. Legally. I want the gate gone. And I want a written apology from the board. Karen looked like he'd just asked for the moon. A public apology, she repeated. Yes, Jason said firmly. You blocked my road and threatened me with prosecution. I want that acknowledged, or the fence goes up tomorrow and the concrete follows the next day. Bowen frowned. Jason, that will inconvenience a lot of innocent people. Jason leaned in slightly. So did your gate. They left without shaking hands. That night, Jason sat by the fire, exhaustion in his bones. He wasn't proud of the wall he was building. He wasn't a vindictive man. But he believed in boundaries, and the HOA had stomped all over his. If they wanted to resolve this, they knew what they had to do. But he was done being the one to bend first. Jason had never been much for paperwork, at least not the kind that involved dusty files, legal jargon, and property lines drawn by men long dead. But this time, every page felt like a weapon. If he was going to win this fight, he needed more than fence posts and grit. He needed proof. He made the hour-long drive back down to the county land records office. The same clerk, Cynthia, greeted him with a tired smile as he stepped in, holding a worn leather briefcase filled with copies of old family documents, letters, and survey maps. You again, she said, sipping from a chipped mug. Let me guess, the HOA still playing hardball. Jason gave her a half-smile. They're trying to, but I'm not giving up that easy. Cynthia led him into the back room, past rows of filing cabinets and flat file map drawers. It smelled of paper, ink, and history, the kind of place where old truths lived. She pulled up a few files on her screen and motioned for him to sit. What exactly are you looking for this time? Proof that the access trail, the original one my grandfather built, was either permitted, recognized, or even mentioned in historical records. Anything that links it to legal usage over time. Cynthia raised an eyebrow. You're going for a prescriptive easement angle. Jason nodded. If I can't prove the easement was recorded, I can at least try to show long-term, uninterrupted use. That trail's been used by my family for 50 years. She typed away, fingers quick and sure. That might work. Colorado law does allow prescriptive easements if you can prove open, notorious, and continuous use for at least 18 years, especially if no one tried to stop you. Jason tapped the briefcase beside him. Letters, photos, an old journal entry from my dad, and a fuel receipt from 1991 showing a propane delivery up that trail. Nice, she smiled. Let's find the rest. They spent the next 4 hours combing through archives. Cynthia unearthed an aerial survey from 1978 that clearly showed a dirt trail winding through what was now Cedar Ridge. There was also a land dispute file from the early 2000s involving a boundary correction nearby, and surprisingly, it included references to the Miller Trail, used as a landmark during mediation. That was gold. Jason scanned and printed everything. As he organized the copies into labeled folders, he felt something tighten in his chest. But it wasn't fear. It was resolve. He was building a fortress of facts, one that could stand up even in court if it had to. By the time he got home, the sun was low, and a white envelope was taped to the front of his door. Formal HOA proposal. Immediate action required. Inside was a 6-page document. The first 3 pages were boilerplate, legal disclaimers, property diagrams, and HOA letterhead. But the final section was the real kicker. In exchange for the removal of the partial fence and halting further construction, Cedar Ridge HOA agrees to the following: immediate removal of the gate installed at the former access trail, legal recognition of historic access via a recorded prescriptive easement filed with the county, a formal letter of acknowledgement from the board stating that Mr. Miller's rights to access his property shall not be infringed. In return, Mr. Miller shall grant a permanent easement for Cedar Ridge Road's current path, refrain from further obstruction or restriction of traffic, drop all current and future claims of trespass or damages against Cedar Ridge HOA. It was better than Jason had expected. Still, he read every word 3 times. No tricks, no slippery phrasing. It was a surrender wrapped in legal etiquette. He almost laughed. The very people who served him papers were now begging for peace. But he didn't sign right away. Instead, he wrote back, "To the Cedar Ridge HOA, I have reviewed your proposal and find it mostly acceptable. However, I request 2 modifications. The letter of acknowledgement must explicitly apologize for the previous accusation of trespass against me. The easement agreement must stipulate that any future changes to road use, gates, or access points affecting my property require my written approval. Make these adjustments, and we have a deal. Jason Miller." He sent it by email and certified mail. No mistakes, no loopholes. 3 days later, the final agreement arrived, updated exactly as requested. Attached was a scanned letter signed by the entire board. We, the undersigned members of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association, formally acknowledge and apologize for the prior accusations and obstructions imposed on Mr. Jason Miller regarding his property access. These actions were made in error, without full understanding of historical usage and property rights. We commit to working cooperatively with Mr. Miller and respecting his legal rights moving forward. Jason stared at the signature line for a long moment before finally letting himself breathe. He'd done it. Not with violence, not with revenge, but with truth, patience, and the law. The next morning, he took down the half-finished fence, post by post. By noon, a crew from the HOA was removing the gate at the original trailhead. And for the first time in weeks, Jason drove freely down his family's road. No locks, no threats, no fear. Just the crunch of gravel beneath his tires and the wind through the pine. His cabin stood where it always had, alone, quiet, and now, finally free. Long before the development of Cedar Ridge, and long before anyone dreamed of HOA meetings and subdivision newsletters, there was just one way in and out of the Miller family's cabin. A winding, rugged trail cut by hand and worn down by decades of foot traffic, horses, and the occasional rumbling pickup truck. That trail, known only to a few as the Delaney Line, had nearly been lost to time, forgotten by the county, ignored by developers, and buried under a web of new roads and concrete. But for Jason Miller, it had always been more than a trail. It was legacy. It was home. Now, with the drama of the HOA behind him, for the moment, Jason decided it was time to revisit the road that started it all. Not just as a landowner protecting his access, but as a man looking to honor the quiet history written into every tree stump and rutted curve. He packed light, a notepad, a trail camera, a bottle of water, and an old map that had belonged to his grandfather. The air was crisp, the sky clear. With each step, the sounds of the modern world fell away. No lawnmowers, no engines, no HOA, just wind and birdsong. He started at the cabin and followed the old footpath north, where the trail branched off from the now cleared access road. It curved through aspen groves, then ducked beneath low-hanging spruce boughs that swayed like old sentinels. Every so often, Jason stopped to take a photo, jot a note, or breathe deeply. He hadn't walked the full trail in years. About halfway in, he found the old wooden sign. Weather-beaten and barely legible, it read, "Delaney Crossing, established 1963. His grandfather had carved it, nailed it up, and forgotten about it. But it stood. So did the story. Jason sat on a rock nearby and unfolded the map. A thin red line traced the route from the base of the hill to the cabin. It crossed land that had once belonged to the Delaney Ranch, long since sold off in parcels, subdivided and repackaged as luxury lots. He found the place where the trail first touched the old ranch border and dug into his backpack, pulling out the weathered letter once more. Frank Delaney's handwriting was stiff and formal, but personal. "I grant my friend Arthur Miller and his family full right to travel by foot, horse, or vehicle along the old trail by Carter Ridge. No money, just honor. This is neighbor to neighbor." Jason read it again, then looked out across the valley. It wasn't just a dirt path. It was a handshake passed down across time, and nearly buried by people who didn't understand what it meant. When he got back to the cabin that evening, he made a decision. He would formally document the trail, not just for himself, but for history. Too much of his family's story had been taken for granted, and nearly taken away. That wouldn't happen again. Over the next week he worked. He walked the trail with the GPS logger, recording every twist and turn. He took photos of key landmarks, marked tree notches from the 70s, and cataloged any sign of use over the years. He even found an old iron horseshoe, half buried under moss, probably from his grandfather's mule, Jasper. Then he went to the county archives again, this time with purpose. "I want to file a historical record," Jason told Cynthia. "I want the Delaney line added to the Community Heritage Registry. It's not an official road, but it's a documented trail used continuously for over 60 years. She raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "That's not something most people do." Jason grinned. "Most people don't have HOA boards trying to erase their family history." With her help, he submitted a complete packet: maps, photos, affidavits, and a formal request to record the trail as a private historical corridor. It wouldn't grant him new legal power, the easement was already secure, but it would protect the path's name and story. A week later, the county approved it, and just like that, Delaney Line became more than an old footpath. It became a preserved landmark, entered into the local land use database, and protected under historical land use status. Back in Cedar Ridge, word spread, not because Jason boasted, but because the residents began to notice something new. At the old trailhead, near the spot where the gate had once stood, there was now a carved wooden sign with a fresh coat of sealant. "Delaney Line Trail, Private Historic Access Route. Established 1963, protected 2025. Maintained by the Miller family." Beneath it was a simple brass plaque that read, "Some roads aren't built with concrete. They're carved in trust." Jason didn't care if the HOA liked it. He wasn't looking for their approval. But quietly, over the following weeks, something changed. Residents who had once glared at him during meetings now offered a polite nod or even a wave as he passed by. One older man named Ellis, who lived near the ridge and had been one of the loudest voices against him early on, stopped by the cabin unannounced with a gift: a jar of homemade peach preserves and a simple apology. "Didn't know the whole story," Ellis said. "Thought you were just another cranky holdout. But that trail, it's something special. Didn't mean to help them erase it." Jason accepted the jar with a quiet nod. Thanks. That means more than you know. Sometimes peace wasn't forged in meetings or lawsuits. Sometimes it grew from understanding, slowly, stubbornly, like pine trees on a mountain ledge. The road was still quiet, but now it spoke. Jason was finally starting to feel peace settle back over Aspen Hollow. The Delaney line was officially recognized by the county. His access was secure. The gate was gone. The road was his again, and the HOA had seemingly stepped back after their quiet surrender. For the first time in weeks, Jason allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, it was over. But quiet doesn't always mean safe, and sometimes what simmers beneath the surface is more dangerous than what roars above it. It started with a letter. Another one. This time from a name Jason didn't recognize, Creswell and Taft, LLP, a high-end law firm out of Denver. The kind that wore $1,000 suits and charged by the minute. The letter was printed on thick, expensive paper and delivered by courier. Jason read it slowly, methodically. His fingers tightened around the edge of the envelope as he took in every word. Unauthorized road obstruction and loss of HOA property value. Our firm represents several residents of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association who are pursuing collective legal action regarding your construction of barriers and threats of road closure. While the HOA board may have previously engaged in negotiation, individual homeowners reserve their right to pursue damages for temporary obstruction of emergency access, intentional infliction of emotional distress, loss of property value due to perceived instability in road access. You are hereby notified that litigation is under consideration, pending your agreement to the following terms within 14 days. Public retraction of all prior statements accusing the HOA or residents of wrongdoing. Immediate dismantling of all trail signage or references to Delaney Line that imply public or historic access. Financial compensation for losses incurred to be calculated. Jason didn't laugh. He didn't even sigh. Instead, he walked to his desk, pulled out a manila folder marked County Filings, and laid out the copies of everything he had submitted. Maps, GPS trail records, historical photographs, Delaney's original letter, the preservation approval from the county, and the signed agreement with the HOA board granting him full access and acknowledging their previous errors. He had anticipated they might try something like this. Not from the board, but from the residents. People angry about fence posts and headlines. People who needed someone to blame for their fear. Jason wasn't interested in fighting 20 lawsuits at once, so he called Mark Dales, the HOA's legal counsel, a man who had tried to bluff him once and now owed him a debt of honesty. "Jason," Mark answered, "I was going to call you. I assume you got the Creswell letter." "I did," Jason said flatly. "Are they serious?" Mark sighed. "I've spoken to them. It's mostly posturing. They've got two homeowners with money and no understanding of land law trying to make noise. But it could escalate." Jason paced the length of the porch. "They're demanding I remove the historic signage and apologize for protecting my own property." "I know. I told them they were out of their minds." "Good, because I'm not removing a damn thing." Mark was quiet a moment before speaking again. "Jason, off the record, you've got everything on your side, legally, historically. Even public sentiment is starting to swing your way. But if they file, it's going to cost you time and money, even if you win." Jason had heard that warning before. Truth didn't always keep you out of court. "What's their real angle?" he asked. "They're hoping to scare you into a settlement, paint you as a hostile landowner. They think if they stir enough dust, you'll fold to avoid the fight." Jason looked out over the ridge, where the road curved along his land, harmless and quiet. He could see why the residents were scared. Their entire neighborhood hinged on one sliver of someone else's land. It was a design flaw that no one had noticed until someone finally said, "Enough." "I'll see them in court if I have to," Jason said, "but I'm not giving up that trail, and I'm not taking down that sign." Mark hesitated. "Then I recommend you get representation, real representation. Creswell and Taft doesn't play small. They'll drag this out." "I've got someone in mind." After the call, Jason drove back into town and made his way to the old law office, tucked between a diner and a fishing gear shop. A wooden sign out front read, "Taylor and Ridge, Property and Water Rights Law." Inside, sitting behind a desk cluttered with file folders and topo maps, was Elena Ridge, a third-generation land attorney with a reputation for knowing mountain property better than the developers themselves. Jason had met her once, years ago, when his father was fighting a zoning change that would have pushed tourists onto their land. "Elena," Jason said, "I've got a mess. I think you'll like it." She looked up, smiled, and gestured to the seat across from her. "Tell me everything." And he did. The HOA, the gate, the fence, the agreements, the threats, the letter from Creswell. He laid out the story from start to finish, with documents to back every word. Elena didn't flinch once. When he finished, she tapped the Creswell letter with a pen. This is noise. They're trying to shake a tree they don't realize is rooted in granite. Can you shut them down? I can make them regret opening their mouths, she said. Give me 10 days. Jason nodded. Good. I'll keep building the trail record in the meantime. She raised an eyebrow. You're still working on that? He smiled faintly. History is never done. 10 days later, a sharply worded response from Elena's office hit Creswell and Taft like a hammer. It included documented evidence of Jason's easement rights, copies of the historic registry acceptance, and a formal cease and desist against further harassment. The letter ended with a simple line. Should any further defamatory claims be made against Mr. Jason Miller, he will not hesitate to pursue countersuit for damages and legal costs. Creswell went quiet. The legal hammer had dropped, but not the one they had expected. It was Jason's, and it hit with the full weight of truth. The days that followed the legal volley from Elena Ridge's office were eerily quiet. No more threatening letters, no more veiled phone calls. The usual hum of disputes that had settled over Aspen Hollow seemed to fade, replaced by an almost unnatural calm. Jason found himself caught between relief and suspicion, because in situations like these, silence often spoke louder than words. He sat on his cabin's porch one afternoon, the sun dipping low behind the spruce trees, casting long shadows over the gravel road. The air smelled of pine and earth, peaceful in a way that had eluded him for weeks. But the peace was fragile. The fight wasn't over. It had simply changed. Sometimes the real battle wasn't in shouting matches or courtrooms, it was in what people didn't say. Jason had learned that lesson the hard way. He pulled his journal from the table and began to write. April 23rd. The silence after the storm is the hardest to bear. It feels like everyone is watching, waiting for the next move, but no one dares to make it. Elena says the legal response shook them. Creswell and Taft disappeared as if someone pulled the rug out from under their plans. But I know the silence is just a pause. The people in the neighborhood aren't monsters. They're scared. Fear makes people do strange things, like side with a faceless board rather than a man with a story. I have to show them who I am beyond the letters and legal documents. Jason closed the journal and stood, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. He wasn't just fighting for the road anymore. He was fighting to be part of the community, to rewrite the narrative of his family's place in Aspen Hollow. He began making small gestures. He helped Ellis fix a leaky fence after the last storm. He offered to mow Mrs. Gardner's lawn when she injured her ankle. He started leaving jars of fresh preserves on neighbors' porches, a silent olive branch. At first, the gestures were met with wary glances, but slowly the ice began to crack. One evening at the Cedar Ridge community picnic, Jason found himself sitting across from Karen, a longtime resident who had been vocal against him in past meetings. "I have to admit," Karen said, handing him a paper plate piled with ribs and coleslaw, "I was wrong about you." Jason blinked. "About what?" "About all of it. The trail, the fight, the gate. I thought you were just trying to stir trouble, but you've been respectful. You care. That counts for something." Jason nodded, swallowing a grin. "It does." The conversation drifted from the trail to family, to the history of the area, stories he had never heard before. Karen told him about her great-grandparents, who had homesteaded nearby, and how the land had changed over the decades. By the end of the evening, Jason felt something shift, an unspoken acceptance beginning to take root. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, Jason noticed subtle changes. The mailboxes near the trail were freshly painted with small signs that read, "Welcome to Cedar Ridge. Respect our heritage." Neighbors started using the Delaney Line Trail for hikes and picnics, leaving footprints where before there had only been silence. The HOA, recognizing the changing tide, quietly removed some of the more aggressive, no trespassing signs and agreed to help maintain parts of the trail. Jason even got an invitation to join the HOA's annual board retreat, a clear sign they were willing to include him in future decisions. He accepted. At the retreat, he spoke honestly about his family's history and the importance of the trail. "I'm not here to fight anyone," he said, voice steady. "I just want to protect what's ours and make sure we all understand what this place means." His words were met with nods, some tentative, some genuine. By the time the meeting ended, Jason realized something powerful. Silence could have been a weapon, but used right, it could become a bridge. That night, he sat by the fire pit outside his cabin, watching the stars blink awake one by one. The road ahead was still uncertain, but the war had softened into something more manageable. For the first time in months, Jason felt the weight on his shoulders lift. Not because the fight was over, but because the fight had changed. It was no longer about gates or legal documents. It was about trust. And sometimes that was the most powerful thing of all. The weeks following the community retreat unfolded in a surprisingly hopeful rhythm. Jason's quiet efforts to build bridges were beginning to bear fruit. Neighbors greeted him with polite smiles instead of cold stares. The tension that had gripped Aspen Hollow began to ease, like a glacier slowly retreating. Yet Jason knew the peace was tentative. Old grudges didn't vanish overnight, especially when a history of suspicion lingered beneath the surface. One afternoon, as Jason was trimming some overgrown branches along the edge of the Delaney line, a familiar truck rumbled up the gravel road. He looked up and recognized the driver immediately. It was Ellis, the same gruff neighbor who had once opposed him most vocally, now approaching with something in his hand. Ellis slowed the truck and climbed down, wiping his hands on a rag. "Jason, got a minute?" "Sure," Jason said, setting down the pruning shears. Ellis walked over and held out an old, dusty box. "Found this in my grandfather's barn. Thought you might want it." Curious, Jason took the box and opened it carefully. Inside were yellowed papers, old photographs, and a leather-bound journal, clearly well used and cherished. "These were my grandfather's," Ellis explained. "He and your granddad were friends back before all this started. He kept records of the land, the trails, the old ways." Jason flipped through the journal. The handwriting was neat but faded, detailing daily notes about weather, wildlife, and neighbors' visits. What caught Jason's eye were maps, hand-drawn in careful detail, showing the routes and boundaries of properties, including the Delaney Line, marked not just as a trail but as a vital connection between homesteads. "This is incredible," Jason said. "It's exactly what we need to show the trail's history." Ellis nodded. "Yeah, I figured it might help clear things up. Too many people here forgot where we all came from." Jason felt a wave of gratitude. "Thank you. This means a lot." Over the next few days, Jason pored over the journal, cross-referencing it with his own collection of documents. The new evidence bolstered his case even further, showing that the trail wasn't just a path. It was a lifeline for families who depended on each other decades ago. He knew this could be the turning point in his struggle for acceptance. At the next HOA meeting, Jason brought the journal and maps with him. The room was packed, with residents curious to see what he had uncovered. As he shared the history captured in Ellis's grandfather's journal, the atmosphere shifted. Eyes softened, whispers faded, and the room filled with a collective sense of connection. One older woman, who had been skeptical before, stood and said, "I never knew the trail had such meaning. It's part of our shared past." Jason nodded. "It still is, and it deserves respect." From that day forward, Ellis became more than just a neighbor. He became an unexpected ally. The two men worked together to organize trail cleanups and community events, inviting others to learn about the rich history they shared. Slowly but surely, the walls between Jason and the community began to crumble. The fight that had once felt like a battle against the world was transforming into a shared effort to preserve something precious. Jason realized that sometimes allies come from the most unlikely places, and when they do, they have the power to change everything. The sun was just beginning to rise over the ridge, spilling golden light across the tops of the towering spruce and trembling aspens. The quiet of the morning settled gently over Aspen Hollow, as if the land itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Jason stood at the edge of the Delaney Line, surveying the path that had become more than just a road. It was a symbol of history, of struggle, of community, and most importantly, of hope. In the past months, so much had changed. The battle with the HOA, the legal threats, the hostile meetings, all had led to this moment where things could finally begin anew. The neighborhood had slowly woven Jason and his family back into its fabric. The old suspicion gave way to cautious acceptance, then to genuine camaraderie. The Delaney Line was no longer just a private access route. It had become a shared heritage trail that connected neighbors, both literally and figuratively. Jason's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Elena Ridge, his attorney and now close friend. "Good morning, Jason. Just heard the news. The county approved the community grant for the trail restoration project. Congratulations." Jason smiled. The grant was a game changer. It meant they could finally start restoring the trail properly, clearing fallen trees, stabilizing eroded sections, and adding educational plaques that told the story of the land and the people who had shaped it. He thought back to the journey that had brought him here, the locked gates, the angry letters, the mounting legal threats. It had been a rough road, one that tested his patience and resolve. But through it all, he had never lost sight of why the trail mattered. Not just to him, but to everyone who called Aspen Hollow home. He walked down the path, stepping carefully over roots and rocks until he reached the wooden sign that marked the trailhead. The brass plaque gleamed in the morning light, the words clear and proud. Delaney Line Trail, Private Historic Access Route. Established 1963, preserved 2025. A path carved in trust. Beside the sign, a group of neighbors had gathered, volunteers ready to roll up their sleeves and breathe new life into the trail. There was Ellis wielding a chainsaw, Karen organizing tools and refreshments, and several families with children, all eager to be part of something meaningful. Jason felt a swell of pride and gratitude. He addressed the group, his voice steady and warm. Thank you all for being here today. This trail isn't just about access. It's about remembering who we are, where we come from, and what we can build together. I'm honored to share this journey with you. Hands clasped together, tools ready, the community set to work. The sound of saws humming, laughter echoing, and leaves rustling filled the air. It was the sound of healing, of bridges being rebuilt, and stories being shared. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Jason found a quiet moment by the fire pit behind his cabin. He pulled out the old journal Ellis had given him and reread a passage about the early settlers. The land may change, the roads may shift, but the spirit of these mountains stays strong, carried by those who walk them with respect and heart. Jason smiled, feeling the truth of those words deep in his bones. The trail ahead was still long, filled with challenges and surprises, but for the first time in years he was ready to walk it with open arms and an open heart. New beginnings were possible, even on the oldest roads. And as the stars blinked awake overhead, Jason knew that the story of Aspen Hollow was far from over. It was just beginning.